All right, tip number one is that you are never too good for the basics. I used to absolutely hate doing exercise like painting colored blocks here. Whenever it come up in a painting class, I'd be like, ugh, I don't want to do that. What's the point? Looking back, I was so wrong. It actually took me going out and painting paintings and failing and not seeing the results I wanted to realize I needed to go back to the basic things that simple exercises like that can show you. Even now, whenever I hit a plateau in my work, I always go back to painting something simple to kind of reset. I'll just do like a very basic, simple still life and see how well I can paint it. Because I know everything that I need to know to get better at painting can be learned through simple paintings like this. And sometimes the fact that they are so simple makes it easier to get direct practice and observation of these key ideas that make paintings work. And one of those key ideas is drawing. And tip number two is understand drawing is probably the most important aspect of painting. Always be practicing your drawing and building your observational skills. Now, some drawing tips I can give you are: one, use a grid. This is gonna help you get an accurate drawing so you can actually get to the painting stage, but it's still gonna require you to utilize and practice some drawing skill. You could also use a proportional divider. I use this a lot on portraits just to help transfer measurements from the reference to the canvas. Another helpful tip is simplify your subject into big shapes first and just draw that. That's gonna be a lot easier to draw than a full detailed drawing. Another tip is look at the negative space when you're drawing. Sometimes seeing those shapes created by the negative space can help you get an accurate drawing. Another drawing tip is pay attention to angles. I'm constantly looking at angles created in the reference and doing my best to replicate those angles, because I know, if I can get those angles right, I'm gonna get the drawing right. Another helpful thing with drawing is plumb lines. Using plumb lines, whether it's your paintbrush or just imagining it, can help you get things lined up. All right, tip number three is think in terms of planes. In this blue cylinder here, I first broke it down into two planes, light and shadow, and it didn't look like a cylinder, it looked like a block. But once I started to add more planes of value, that cylinder form started to appear. Thinking in terms of planes is gonna help you identify the correct color and value. This is why I sculpted plain fruit out of clay and use those as exercises for my students, because it becomes very clear the shifts in value and color. Whereas in normal fruit that's smooth, the shifts aren't as clear. But constructing it with the planes in mind first is gonna help you portray the form. And you can always soften those transitions and make it look more realistic afterwards. Thinking of planes is also gonna help with your brush work. When I'm painting, I'm thinking about the planes and I'm thinking about as if I'm running my brush along that plane. Same thing with portraits. I'm always thinking about the planes of the face to help guide me in making value changes and the direction of my brush work. All right, tip number four is always be thinking about the form of what you're painting. No matter what it is that I'm painting, I'm always trying to think about it in its most simplest form, which a lot of times is like these colored block shapes. Take a cylinder, for example. Whenever I'm painting tree trunks, I'm thinking of them as a cylinder and thinking about, all right, which side is the light coming from? And how am I gonna portray that cylinder form of that tree trunk using color and value? And form is always my first concern with painting an object, not the texture. For example, with this pineapple, I wanted to make sure to get just the base form of the spherical shape of the pineapple before I added in the texture of the pineapple. Same thing goes with hair. Like when I was painting this bear, I wanted to make sure to get the spherical form of the belly of the bear before I actually went in and made the indications to suggest that it's hair and fur. Same thing goes with hair on a person. Like when I'm painting locks of hair, I'm thinking of it in terms of its big overall form as if it was, a sculpture. Like a lot of times it's helpful to look at sculptures of heads to kind of shift your mind on how to think about hair. It's just these big masses of clay with a light side and a shadowed side. And if you think about that first, it's gonna make adding details and doing those little things to make it read as hair. All right, tip number five is always start with light and shadow. For example, with this red sphere, there's a lot of different value changes in there, but I'm first just blocking out into the light family and the shadow family. I do this with pretty much any subject that I paint. I find it's a very helpful first step that will help you organize your values as you go forward. Because once I have the light and shadow figured out, then I'm just gonna find more subtle value shifts within those two families of light and dark. And a tip when working with light and dark is try and work dark to light and thin to thick with your paint. It's a lot easier to lighten paint as you go opposed to darkening it, and it's easier to build thicker paint on top of thinner paint. So a lot of times my darks are relatively thin, you know, not transparent. They're thin with just paint thinner, so they're gonna set up pretty easily, and it's gonna be easier for me to build thicker paint on top of it. That's why a lot of times in my paintings, the lightest parts are the parts with the thickest paint. All right, tip number 6 is always be comparing values. More specifically, the values of the whole painting. You don't want to get zeroed in to too small of an area for too long. For example, with the background in this painting, I really had to thread the needle in making sure that it was darker than the red sphere, but lighter than the shadowed side of the block and the cylinder. And always remember that value is more important than color. You could get the colors wrong, but as long as the value is there, the painting is going to work. And again, coming back to planes, change in value is going to help indicate plane shifts, which is going to help indicate the form and the structure. So value is how you're going to create form. And the more value shapes you can find, the more you're gonna have to work with in creating the form. This is illustrated really well with the cutout filter in Photoshop that I use with portraits sometimes. And you can start with just 2 values and then progressively add in more values. And as you add in more values, there's more form being portrayed. If you struggle with values, I suggest doing paintings in black and white. Probably one of the most helpful things you could do is actually take a photo reference that's in color and paint it just using black and white. A helpful tip I do a lot of times to help me get the right values is I'll get my darkest darks in first because it shows me one end of the value scale and I can use that to compare other values that I put in. Another thing you can do is get your lightest light in relatively early. Even if you know you're going to repaint it or paint it out later on, having that in will give you the other end of the value scale and it's gonna make it that much easier to figure out where the other values are gonna fall in the painting. Tip number 7, pay attention to color saturation. Always be asking yourself, how vibrant is this color or how dull is this color? For example, in this painting, the background is a very desaturated purple. It's not very vibrant, but that makes the blocks that are vibrant colors seem that much more vibrant. If I had made this background a very vibrant, rich purple, the blocks wouldn't have popped out as much. And you can desaturate a color by adding its complement. Now, if you don't understand complement colors, I actually offer the color mixing lesson from my Foundations of Oil Painting course for free. If you want to check that out, there's a link to it in the description of this video. But color saturation is a cool thing because you can use it to guide the viewer's attention. For example, with this painting, depending on which block I made the most saturated, could dictate where the viewer's eye is going to go. This is something very important to keep in mind when developing a focal point of a painting. All right, tip number 8 is when trying to identify a color, start with the color of the object. For example, with this pyramid, I know that the pyramid itself is yellow, but for the shadowed side, it's darker, it's desaturated, so I know, all right, if it's desaturated, I need to add yellow's complement, which is purple. And I actually happen to have a purple already mixed up from my background, so I actually just mixed some yellow into that. This is another little helpful color mixing tip, which is reuse colors that you've already mixed on your palette. I've got a lot of students ask like, oh, like how do you just use one palette for a whole painting and not run out of space? And I say it's because I reuse piles and I branch off from them. This is gonna help give your painting color harmony and also just help you develop a good instinct for color. All right, tip number 9 is always be adjusting as you go. One of the best things about oil paint is that it's easy to change and adjust and manipulate on the canvas. I know when you first start oil painting, the fact that the paint stays so wet can be very scary, especially if you're used to watercolors and acrylics that dry really fast and it's all about layering. Oil paint is about manipulating and pushing and pulling. For example, when I got this pyramid painted in, it made me realize, ooh, I need to adjust the value of the green in my block. So I went back and I lightened that. Painting is like putting together a puzzle, and the more pieces you have, the easier it's going to be. As I'm painting, I'm constantly stepping back and taking in the painting as a whole and asking myself a checklist of questions about the fundamentals to make decisions on what to change and alter. If you want to know that checklist, I've actually made a whole video on that. If you want to see that, I'll put a link to it above right now. All right, and the last tip, probably my favorite tip, is always be paying attention to edges. One of the most clearest indications of an advanced painter is their ability to handle and manipulate edges. Because most beginner painters want to identify every single edge they see. That's not really how the human eye works. You know, we can only focus on one thing at a time and everything else kind of fades away or gets blurred or lost. Painting every single edge is going to make you paint like a camera when you should be trying to paint the way we see. In this painting, you can see there's a lot of areas where I have lost edges, where you can't really see where one object ends and another begins. There's also a variety of edges. I have soft edges, you know, transferring from light to shadow, and hard edges from light to shadow. Speaking of shadows, a lot of cast shadows are going to have softer edges because it's a shadow. It's not a concrete object. Edges are really important when it comes to indicating hair. I use a lot of soft edges when I'm trying to indicate fur or hair. When I'm painting trees, again, soft edges or broken up edges. If you make those edges too crisp, the tree's gonna look like it's a cardboard cutout. When I'm identifying value shapes within a face in a portrait, I'm making sure to work and blend those value shapes together to get soft transitions where I need it. If you ever want to study a master painter in edges, check out some of John Singer Sargent's portraits. I feel like in all of his portraits, the edges are so deliberate, whether they're lost or soft or hard. So take these 10 tips, apply them to your paintings, and if you like the results and you post your paintings on Instagram, make sure to tag me at Forza43 or use the hashtag PaintCoach. I'm Chris Fornatero, here telling you to go get painting.